literary history and literary terms. In English literature, we study different ages through the light of history of English literature. We study Elizabethan age, then neoclassical age. Today we will read Victorian age. How was the economic scenario of the Victorian age? Victorian age was a time of economic prosperity. The economic scenario of this age was marked by rapid advancement in industrialization and scientific progress. The rising imperialism brought rich dividends to the people of England, which in turn made their life more luxurious. Wealth brought with it many evils too, like the social snobbery and a decline in art and culture. But overall, it was an era of prosperity, an era of aggressive nationalism and rising imperialism. Morality and respectability were the chief characteristics of the Victorian era. The emphasis on conventional morality was partly a reaction against the corruption of earlier age, scandals of Byron and radicalism of Shelley, who did not hesitate even from depicting the incest. Moral duty remained for most Victorian a categorical imperative. Victorian age was the age of scientific revolution. The advance of science revolutionized the physical and social environment and profoundly affected the outlook and temper of man as well as intellectual activity during the period. The revolutionary theories of Darwin, Herbert Spencer and Wallace completely revolutionized the contemporary views about man and society. Faith is a biblical view of cosmology and creation was shaken and was replaced by the Darwinian theory of evolution through struggle for existence. The effects of zoological and biological discoveries shook to its depths, and the old cosmogony and general spiritual unrest is reflected in mid-Victorian poetry. Blank verse literally is a term applied to all unrhymed verse, but as usually restricted to unrhymed verse written in iambic pentameter. Marlowe, Spencer, Milton, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Tennyson all wrote in beautiful blank verse. Free verse implies a kind of poetry that lacks regular meter. Its lines are irregular and its rhymes are natural. Free verse does not have any regular metrical pattern but uses cadence by alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables. T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams and many other modern poets have used this measure in their poetry. Dramatic monologue is a poem in which a single character, who is invariably not the poet himself, speaks to the audience and the reader and reveals the personality of his own and that of readers, its situation and the context of conversation. There are three important characteristics of a dramatic monologue. There is a single speaker other than the poet who speaks the entire poem in a specific situation as a critical moment. This speaker interacts with one or more other people and the monologue reveals the character and temperament of the speaker. Dramatic monologue is a kind of poem in which a single character other than the poet speaks to a silent audience consisting of one or more persons and thus indirectly to the reader. By the use of this ड्रामेटिक मोनोलॉग, जिसे हिंदी में बोलते हैं नाटकीय एकालाप। नाटकीय एकालाप एक ऐसी कविता होती है जिसमें एक चरित्र जो अनिवार्य रूप से कवि नहीं है, दर्शकों से तथा पाठक से मुखातिब होता है। Dramatic monologue is a poem in which a single character, who is invariably not the poet himself, speaks to the audience and the reader and reveals the personality of his own and that of readers, his situation and context of conversation. नाटकीय एकालाप में अपनी स्थिति एवं बातचीत के संदर्भ को भी प्रकट करता है। इसे प्रकट करने के तीन तरीके, तीन मुख्य विशेषताएं बताता है। इसमें एक ही वाचक होता है जो किसी निर्णायक क्षण पर एक विशेष परिस्थिति में पूरी कविता को स्वयं ही पढ़ता है। यह वाचक एक से अधिक व्यक्तियों से बात करता है और यह वाचक स्वयं के व्यक्तित्व एवं स्वभाव को अभिव्यक्त करता है। यह ड्रामेटिक मोनोलॉग एक ऐसी कविता होती है जिसमें कवि से इतर कोई दूसरा चरित्र ऐसे शांत पात्रों से बात करता है जो संख्या में एक या एक से अधिक होते हैं और इस प्रकार अप्रत्यक्ष रूप से पाठक से बात करता है। इस नाटकीय एकालाप का प्रयोग करके वह स्वयं को पाठक एवं दर्शकों से अपनी स्थिति को एवं बातचीत के संदर्भ को परिचित कराता है तथा इसमें अपनी स्वयं के एवं दर्शकों के व्यक्तित्व को व्यक्त करता है। यह चरित्र काल्पनिक या ऐतिहासिक प्रतिरूपण होता है। अंग्रेजी साहित्य में नाटकीय एकालाप के प्रमुख उदाहरण हैं टेनिसन की यूराइसिस, टी.एस. एलियट की द लव सॉन्ग ऑफ जे. एल्फ्रेड प्रूफरॉक। परंतु नाटकीय एकालाप का गुरु तो रॉबर्ट ब्राउनिंग ही था, जिसे अपनी कविताओं से इसका प्रयोग करके इसके साथ अपना नाम जोड़ दिया। उसकी कुछ प्रसिद्ध कविताएं हैं फ्रा लिपो लिपी, माई लास्ट डचेज, द बिशप ऑर्डर्स हिज टॉम, एंड्रयू डेल सार्लो, पोर्फायरियाज लवर्स। So similarly, we can define it in dramatic monologue is a kind of poem in which a single character other than the poet speaks to a silent audience consisting of one or more persons and thus indirectly to the reader. By the use of this monologue, he familiarizes the reader with himself, his audience, his situation, the context of conversation, and also reveals his and his audience's personalities. The character is fictional or historical imperialization. Major example of this form in English are Tennyson's Ulysses, 1842. T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock in 1917. But the master of dramatic monologue was Robert Browning, who made the form his own by his constant and expert use of in his poems. A few popular poems of his are Fra Lippi, My Last Duchess, The Beasts of Correct Orders of His Tomb, Andrea del Sarto, Porphyria's Lovers, etc. नेक्स्ट ड्रामेटिक लॉग के बाद हम पढ़ते हैं शॉर्ट नोट्स जो अक्सर पूछे जाते हैं एग्जाम में। इनस्कैप तथा इंस्कैप तथा इंस्ट्रेस हॉपकिंस के आलोचनात्मक सिद्धांतों की कुंजी के समान हैं। इनस्केप का विचार एक महत्वपूर्ण सौंदर्यपरक खोज है। इसका बोध इस आधार पर होता है कि कवि तथा कलाकार के लिए प्राकृतिक सौंदर्य का धुंधला सा बोध संतोषजनक नहीं होता। इंस्केप कलाकार द्वारा प्राकृतिक सौंदर्य की विशिष्टता का बोधक होता है। यह उस विशिष्ट सौंदर्य से संबंधित है जो प्रत्येक वस्तु को उसकी विशिष्टता प्रदान करता है। क्लाइव वेल तथा बाद के अनेक लेखकों ने इसे सिग्निफिकेंट फॉर्म कहा है। इंस्कैप को देख लेने के बाद लेखक पर जो प्रभाव पड़ता है वह इंस्ट्रेस होता है। इंस्केप का विचार हॉपकिंस के मध्ययुगीन दार्शनिक डंस स्कॉटस से लिया गया है। इंस्केप से तात्पर्य उस क्रियाशील विशिष्ट युग से है जो किसी वस्तु को विशिष्टता प्रदान करता है। हॉपकिंस ने अपनी कविताओं में पाठकों को प्राकृतिक सौंदर्य के इसी इंस्केप को स्पष्ट करने तथा पाठकों को उसका अनुभव कराने का प्रयत्न किया है। वह आंतरिक शक्ति जो इस इंस्केप को संभाले रखती है उसे हॉपकिंस ने इंस्ट्रेस का नाम दिया है। इंस्केप एंड इंस्ट्रेस आर द कीज to Hopkins' critical doctrines. The conception of inscape is an aesthetic discovery of great importance. It arises from the realization that for the artist a mere vague impression of natural beauty is unsatisfactory. Inscape is the distinctive pattern perceived in nature by the artist. The species of individually distinctive beauty. It is what Clive Bell and later writers have called significant form. Interest is the effect on the artist's mind of the perception of inscape. Hopkins got the idea of inscape from the medieval philosophers Duns Scotus. By inscape is meant that particular active quality of being that gives to any object is its individuality. Hopkins attempted in much of his poetry to make man aware of the inscape of objects of natural beauty. This distinctness of form and shape of an object was called inscape by Hopkins, and the inner energy which maintains and sustains this distinctiveness and individuality of each object was called as interest by Hopkins. Dear friends, scholars and learners, those who are studying English literature in the different universities, Indian and international universities, all those who are listening, I heartily welcome all of you. प्रथम विश्व युद्ध ने युद्ध कविता का प्रस्फुटन देखा। सशस्त्र सेनाओं में सैनिकों के बीच युवा कवियों का समूह भी था जिसने कविता लेखन को भी अपना लिया था। इस प्रवृत्ति ने ही युद्ध कविता को जन्म दिया। इसके अनेक लेखकों ने अपनी मूलभूत प्रतिभा की अपेक्षा अपनी भावनाओं की गंभीरता के द्वारा अपेक्षाकृत प्रशंसा अर्जित की। उन नए कवियों में सर्वाधिक विशिष्ट रूपर्ट ब्रूक, सीजफ्राइड, सेशन और विल्फ्रेड ओवन आदि हैं। अन्य युद्ध कवियों में जूलियन ग्रोगेल, जूनियल ग्रोफेल, C.H. सॉर्ली, एडमंड ब्लूडेन, लॉरेंस बिनियन, रॉबर्ट ग्रेजेस और रूपर्ट निकोलस आदि है। वार पोइट्री में सबसे सुंदरतम उदाहरण द सोल्जर पोइट, जो कि रूपर्ट ब्रूक के द्वारा लिखी गई है, बहुत ही सुंदर वर्णन किया है। द फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वार सो outburst of war poetry. A group of young poets among the soldiers in the armed forces took to writing poetry. This gave birth to what is called war poetry. Many of its writers won praise rather by the stark insincerity of their sentiments than by original genius, while many more we killed before promise had time to ripen into fruition. The most significant of those new poets are Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, and Wilfred Owen. Among the other war poets are Julian Grenfell, C.H. Sorley, Edmund Bluden, Lawrence Binion, Robert Craigs, and Robert Nicholas. According to Edward Albert, these very years may be broadly divided into two distinct phases. The first was one of the patriotic fervor and idealist illusions of romantic conceptions and heroic ideas. To this early phase belongs Rupert Brooke, but Barnes grew more appealing and the end seemed as distant as ever. Other poets arose with the declared intention of snattering the illusion of the splendor of war by a frankly realistic picture of the suffering, brutality, squalor, and futility of the struggle. To this latter group of war poet belongs Wilfred Owen. Rupert Brooke is usually considered typically of the early group of war poetry. He joined the army in 1914 and in the following years died on active service in the Mediterranean. But he left behind a thin book of verse, many of which are always included in the anthologies of 20th century was poetry. Next, short notes that are or that may you have to express in your examination. Ballad. The ballad is a short story in verse, originally intended to be sung to an audience. Since it developed at an early stage in man's culture evolution, its subjects are deeds rather than thoughts, and they are of the simplest kind, such as memorable fun, a thrilling adventure, a family disaster, love and war, and the like. The tale is usually fierce and tragic, and frequently introduces the supernatural. The poem is written in the ballad measure, a quatrain, in which the first and third lines are 4-foot iambic. Iambic, a short syllable followed by long, and the second and fourth free feet iambic, the latter alone rhyming. Kinds of ballad. बैलेड काव्य में लिखी एक छोटी कहानी होती है। काव्य में लिखी हुई एक छोटी कहानी होती है। प्रारंभ में इसे जनता के सामने सुनाने के लिए रचा जाता था। मानव के सांस्कृतिक उत्थान की प्रारंभिक अवस्था में रचे जाने के कारण बैलेड की विषय सामग्री प्रायिक कार्यों पर अधिक आधारित है, विचार पर कम। कथाएं भी अक्सर बड़ी साधारण होती हैं, जैसे कोई झगड़े की स्मरणीय घटना, किसी परिवार की मुसीबत, प्रेम तथा युद्ध तथा इसी प्रकार की अन्य घटनाएं। कथा अक्सर बड़ी खतरनाक तथा दुखांत होती है तथा अक्सर इसमें दैवी शक्तियों के द्वारा भी कोई भाग लिया हुआ दिखाया जाता है। कविता बैलेड छंद में लिखी जाती है। इसमें एक क्वार्टरेन तथा जिसमें प्रथम एवं तीसरी पंक्ति 4 फुट आयम्बिक होती है तथा दूसरी एवं चौथी पंक्ति 3 फुट आयम्बिक की होती है। दूसरी तथा चौथी पंक्तियों की तुक मिलती है। अलग अलग प्रकार की बैलेड्स लिखी गई हैं अलग अलग टाइम में। बैलेड्स आर प्राइमरली ऑफ 2 काइंड्स, 2 प्रकार की होती हैं प्राथमिक रूप से बैलेड्स। द बैलेड ऑफ ग्रोथ, ऑल्सो कॉल्ड द ऑथेंटिक बैलेड ऑफ unknown authorship, which has been in existence for ages, and the ballad of art of literary ballad, which may be described as a literary development of the traditional form. The one is genuine, having grown up natural among a primitive race, and the other imitative, being a conscious attempt in the ballad manner. Some of the best known among the authentic ballads are Chennai Chase, the wife of Users Well, and Sir Patrick Spence. Among the literary ones, Scott's Eve of St. John, Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and Kent's La Bella Dame Sans Mercy. A minor form of the ballad of art, as in the case of the epic, is the mock ballad, in which a comic theme is treated with the seriousness appropriate to a ballad. It follows its model closely in everything but its humorous subject. Cowper's John Gilpin is a famous example. Sprung rhythm. Regarding the sprung rhythm, W.B. Yeats observes the publication of his work in 1918 made sprung was the fashion, and now his influences has replaced that of Hardy and Bridges. In sprung verse, a foot may have one or many syllables without altering the meter. Who counts stress, not syllable. It is the meter of the Samson agonists. Chores and has given new vitality to much contemporary verse. It enables a poet to employ words taken over from science or to suggest hurried conversation where only one or two words in a sentence are important, to bring about a change in poetical writing like that in the modern speech of the stage where only those words which affect the situation are important. Sprung rhythm is a flexible stress rhythm using feet varying from one isolated stress syllable to pionic feet for syllables or for special effects. Feet containing even more unstressed syllables or the extra metrical quadriders. Sprung rhythm reads and scans purely by stress and not by number of syllables. This means that language does not need to be forced on the Procrustean bed of meter. Idyll or idylls. Although it is impossible to define the idyll as a definite literary form, the adjective idyllic has come to be synonyms with the rustic, pastoral, and tranquil. The mood first created by the Alexandrian poet. Idyll, also spelled idyll, from Greek idyllion, little picture, a short poem of a pastoral or rural character in which something of the element of landscape is depicted or suggested. The term was used in Greco-Roman antiquity to designate a variety of brief poems on simple subjects in which the description of natural objects was introduced. The conventions of the pastoral were developed by an Alexandrian school of poetry, particularly by Theocritus, Bion, and Moschus in the 3rd century BC. And the idylls of Theocritus are the source of the popular idea of this poem. The word was revived during the Renaissance when some poets employed it to distinguish narrative pastorals from those in dialogue. The general use or misuse of the word arose in 19th century from the popularity of two works, the Idylls, Heroicus 1858 of Victor Richard de Lapgrade, and the Idyllus of the King 1859 of Alfred Lord Tennyson, neither of which was related to the pastoral tradition. Thereafter the word was used indiscriminately to refer to works on a variety of subjects. Next literary term is irony. आयरोनी एक पात्र द्वारा अपने वास्तविक अर्थ तथा विचारों के विपरीत अभिव्यक्त है। आयरोनी एक पात्र द्वारा अपने वास्तविक अर्थ अथवा विचारों के विपरीत अभिव्यक्ति है, जो कि बड़ी जोर देने वाली, मनोरंजक अथवा व्यंग्यपूर्ण होती है। यह एक ऐसा कथन है जिसमें वक्ता का छिपा हुआ अर्थ होता है, परंतु जो उसके बाहरी कथन से बिल्कुल भिन्न होता है। नाटककार आयरनी का प्रयोग तब करता है जबकि किसी पात्र के कथन के अर्थ में अथवा कार्यकलाप में और दर्शकों की समझ में अंतर हो। इस प्रकार से वक्ता की अज्ञानता और दर्शकों की जानकारी में अंतर होता है। यह द्विअर्थी वक्तव्य ही आयरनी की मूल भावना है। Irony is the expression of one's meaning by saying the direct opposite of one's thoughts in order to be emphatic, amusing or sarcastic. It is a statement in which the hidden meaning intended by the speaker differs from that which he outwardly declares. The dramatist uses irony when there is a difference in the meaning of speech or action of the character and the understanding of the spectator. Thus there is a contrast between the speaker's ignorance and the spectator's knowledge of it. This duality is very soul of irony. Next is epic, जिसे आप हिंदी के अंदर महाकाव्य पढ़ते हैं। हम महाकाव्य या एपिक एक लंबी वर्णनात्मक कविता होती है जिसकी विषय वस्तु महन गंभीर विषय की होती है तथा जिसकी शैली भी विषयानुकूल उच्च स्तर की गंभीरता लिए होती है। इसमें केंद्र में एक महान पात्र होता है जो नायक होता है या आंशिक रूप से दिव्य शक्ति से संपन्न होता है। इसी व्यक्ति के क्रियाकलाप पर किसी कबीले, देश या मानव जाति का भाग्य निर्भर होता है। मिल्टन के महाकाव्य पैराडाइज लोस्ट का संबंध मानव जाति के प्रथम पूर्वज एडम और ईव के भाग्य से संबंधित है। इसका प्रभाव पूरी मानव जाति पर पड़ा। मिल्टन के महाकाव्य के विषय से गंभीर विषय कोई हो ही नहीं सकता। कुछ महाकाव्य पारंपरिक महाकाव्य होते हैं, जैसे इलियाड और ओडिसी ग्रीक होमर के पारंपरिक महाकाव्य हैं। कुछ महाकाव्य साहित्यिक होते हैं, इनकी रचना पारंपरिक महाकाव्यों की शैली का अनुसरण करते हुए कवि करते हैं। मिल्टन का पैराडाइज लोस्ट इसी श्रेणी का महाकाव्य है। सामान्य परंपराएं इसमें जुड़ी हुई हैं। महाकाव्य के गठन, घटनाओं के चुनाव आदि में कुछ पारंपरिक रीतियां हैं जिनका एपिक की कथा के वर्णन में पालन किया जाता है। महाकाव्य का वर्णन इसकी कथा व उद्देश्य के वर्णन के साथ प्रारंभ होता है। कवि कविता की देवी या अन्य शक्ति की वंदना करता है जो कि उसे उसके महान काव्य की रचना में सहायता करे। ईश वंदना के बाद कवि कविता की देवी के प्रति महाकाव्य प्रसन्न प्रस्तुत करता है। इस प्रसन्न के उत्तर से महाकाव्य का औपचारिक प्रारंभ हो जाता है। महाकाव्य की कथा का वर्णन कथा के किसी मध्य भाग से होता है जो क्रियाकलाप का बड़ा संवेदनशील व महत्वपूर्ण भाग होता है। पैराडाइज लोस्ट में नरक का वर्णन पतित देवदूतों के वर्णन से होता है। कथा के मुख्य पात्रों का संक्षिप्त वर्णन होता है। उदाहरणतः पैराडाइज लोस्ट के प्रथम अध्याय में मिल्टन का पतित देवदूतों का वर्णन, इन पात्रों के भाषण प्राय कराए जाते हैं जिनमें उनकी विभिन्न प्रकृतियों तथा चारित्रिक विशेषताओं का पता चलता है। An epic is a long narrative poem on a great and serious subject, related to an elevated style and centered on a heroine or a quasi-divine figure on whose action depends the fate of a tribe, a nation or the human race. Milton's epic Paradise Lost is concerned with the fate of mankind's earliest ancestors, Adam and Eve. This ultimately affected mankind. There cannot be a more serious subject than the subject of Milton's epic. There are traditional epics or folk epic, that is the Iliad and Odyssey of Greek Homer. Then there are literary epics composed by poets in a deliberate imitation of the traditional form. Of this kind is Milton's Paradise Lost. There are some common conventions regarding the epic that must be quoted and written by the examinee while appearing in examination. There are commonly adopted conventions in the structure and in the choice of episodes of the topic or the epic narrative. Some of them are: the narrator begins the topic stating his objective, theme, and description of the poetry. The poet invokes a muse or guiding spirit to inspire him in his great undertaking. After the invocation to the muse, the poet addresses to the muse the epic question, the answer to which inaugurates the narrative proper. The story of the epic starts with some middle part of the epic story. It is very important and sensitive part of the action. Paradise Lost begins with the description of fallen angels. There are catalogues of the principal characters introduced in a formal detail, that is Milton's description of the procession of fallen angels in Book 1 of Paradise Lost. These characters are often given set speeches which reveal their diverse temperament, that is the debate in Pandemonium Book 2. In Paradise Lost Book 1, Satan's speech to Beelzebub is most characteristic of the Satan. Heroic couplet. What is heroic couplet? Why do we study heroic couplet? हीरोइक कपलेट में दो आयाम्बिक पेंटामीटर होते हैं, 10 मात्रा की पंक्तियां। यह दोनों पंक्तियां एक तुक से बंधी होती हैं। इसे हीरोइक इसलिए कहा जाता है क्योंकि 10 मात्रा वाला आयाम्बिक पद चाहे तुकांत हो या अतुकांत, प्राय अंग्रेजी महाकाव्य में जिसमें वीर गाथा वर्णित हो प्रयोग किया जाता है। हीरोइक कपलेट की मुख्य विशेषताएं हैं: प्रथम पंक्ति के बाद एक विश्राम है जो अर्धविराम के द्वारा दिखाया जाता है। यह इस बात को दर्शाता है कि यहाँ तक आधा अर्थ समाप्त हो गया। कपलेट के अंत में पूर्ण विराम चिन्ह द्वारा प्रदर्शित विश्राम होता है। यह पूर्ण विराम इस बात का द्योतक है कि कपलेट का अर्थ पूर्ण हो गया। एक कपलेट से दूसरे कपलेट में अर्थ को ले जाने से बचा जाता है। कपलेट अपने में पूर्ण होता है। इसका अर्थ समझने के लिए किसी पूर्व कपलेट या बाद के कपलेट की आवश्यकता नहीं होती। इसकी तुक भी एक ऐसी होती है, दोनों पंक्तियों के तुक वाले शब्द एक मात्रिक होते हैं, जैसे ग्रो और सो एक मात्रिक शब्द हैं। प्रत्येक कपलेट में 10 मात्राएं होती हैं। 2 तुक वाले पद कम पाए जाते हैं। Same study material related to this literary item we study in English. Heroic couplet. The heroic couplet consists of 2 iambic pentameters, 10 syllabled lines rhyming together. We think our fathers fools, so wise we grow. Our wiser sons no doubt will think us so. Alexander Pope. It is called heroic house's 10-syllabic iambic verse, whether it rhymes or not. It is usual form for epic verse in English, celebrating heroic exploits. The characteristics of the heroic couplet as printed by Dr. Brigadish PD are as follows. There is pause at the end of the first line indicated by a comma signifying partial completion of the sentence. There is a pause at the end of the couplet indicated by a full stop signifying full completion of the sentence. The running of the sentence from couplet to couplet is avoided. The couplet is closed, not requiring the aid of either a predecessor or successor to complete its meaning. The rhythm is also single. Rhyming parts of each line are single syllables, that is, grow and so are single syllables. The number of syllables is 10. The odd ones unaccented or short, the even accented or long. Treble rhythm as in light by and light by and bright by is rarely found. The couplet quoted above is a fine example of the heroic couplet. The use of the heroic couplet has varied from time to time and from author to author. It was practiced most correctly by Pope. Next, last but not the least, we will study conceit, which is the most important literary term and item. Conceit. A conceit is a clever or unusual metaphor or comparison. It is a technical term. Conceits are ordinarily defined as humorous or witty thoughts or expressions. Alan Tate defines it this. Alan Tate defines it thus: it is an idea not inherent in the subject, but exactly parallel to its elaborated beyond the usual stretch of metaphor into a supporting structure for a long passage or even an entire poem. It may be torn away from its original meaning and yet remain the vehicle of poetic truth, that is to say, of heightened emotion in the poet's dramatization of his own personality. The conceit in itself is neither true nor false. Rilke, comparing the conceits of Donne and Milton, says, when Milton does fall into a vein of conceit, it is generally both trivial and obvious, with none or the saving quality of Donne's remoter extravagances. In Donne's, they are hardly extravagances. The vast overshadowing canopy of his imagination seems to bring the most widely dissimilar thing together with cash. Together with case. In the poem Good Morrow, playing upon the recent discovery of two hemispheres of the globe, Donne compares the reflection of each lover's face into an eye of the other to a hemisphere, and the two reflections together making up a better word than the geographical one. कंसीट असाधारण एवं असामान्य उपमाय रूपक होता है। सामान्यतः कंसीट हास्यपूर्ण या वैदग्यपूर्ण विचारों या कथनों को कहा जाता है। एल्टन टैट ने इसकी परिभाषा किस प्रकार की है? यह एक ऐसा विचार है जो मूल विषय में शामिल नहीं है परंतु पूर्णतः इसके समानांतर होता है। इसका वर्णन सामान्य मेटाफोर से अधिक विस्तृत रूप से किया जाता है। यह लंबे कथन के रूप में या पूरी कविता के रूप में हो सकता है। यह अपने मूल अर्थ से बिल्कुल अलग भी हो सकता है और फिर भी काव्यगत सत्य का उद्घाटन करने का माध्यम हो सकता है। तत् कवि के अपने व्यक्तित्व के नाटकीयकरण की भावना के तीव्र अभिव्यक्ति के रूप में भी हो सकता है। अपने आप में कंसीट न सत्य होता है न झूठ। डन तथा मिल्टन के कंसीट की तुलना करते हुए रैले कहते हैं, जब मिल्टन कंसीट का प्रयोग करते हैं तो यह महत्वपूर्ण नहीं होता तथा बहुत स्पष्ट होता है। इनकी विशेषताएं उनमें नहीं होती। उनके काव्य में यह कंसीट अतिशयोक्तियां नहीं लगते। उसकी कल्पना के विशाल छाते के नीचे सर्वाधिक भिन्न चीजें भी सरलतापूर्ण समान वस्तुएं भी सी दिखाई देती हैं। उसके विचारों के सामने वास्तविकता अवास्तविकता से लगती है तथा अवास्तविकता वास्तविकता से लगती है। पृथ्वी के दो गोलार्धों की नई खोज का संदर्भ देते हुए उन प्रेमियों के प्रत्येक चेहरे की आंख में दिखाई देने वाली परछाई की तुलना एक गोलार्ध से करता है तथा दोनों परछाइयां मिलकर भौगोलिक संसार से बेहतर संसार बनाती है। So dear friends, scholars, learners, you are preparing for English literature. What are the fundamentals and basics of the English literature? You must go through this lecture for your deep understanding in the different type of items. How to define Victorianism and its specific traits? The Victorian Age was a long stretch of time of comparative peace from 1837 to 1901. The spirit of Victorianism was predominant during this period. On one hand, it is represented by libraries staked with leather-bound books and families gathered to listen to readings from the Bible or some other lesser-known work. On the other, it also projects picture of underpaid workers rioting in the streets and young children working in factories. It was the mark of Victorian period that ladies dressed in long-sleeved full gown gave the impression of prudish morality. The falsity or the vain moral code reflected in the many works of literature. It was an age of doubt and uncertainty, of questioning of old values and search for new ones. Major thinkers and major philosophers like Marx, Darwin, Freud came into their own during the century of unprecedented intellectual activity. The poets like Tennyson, Browning and Arnold gave an enhanced look of romanticism in their works. It was new vein of its own kind and marked Victorianism. Write a short note on the realism in the modern age. The modern writers discarded the decadence of romantic tradition and looked for realism as the material for their works. The modern writer is tickled by squalor and dirtiness of the industrial civilization. Moreover, the habit caused by the First World War has led a reflection in the meaning and purpose of life. Even science and new forms of government are held suspended. The hectic activities of urban life and commercial exploitation that is remnant in the modern society makes the writer of either poetry or prose, drama or fiction search for a new system of values. There is a great disillusionment about the so-called comfort and provided by science. The stark reality of life has been reduced to poverty, disparity of rich and poor, unemployment, restlessness, quarrels and degeneration in almost all fields. All such sights become food of the writers, and stark realism is the chief mood of the modern writers. Describe the of the Victorian age poems. The poetry of a period generally reflects the main characteristics of its intellectual life, but it may be doubled. Whether the Victorian poetry does so historically, perhaps prose fiction is the most important, or at any rate the most characteristic product of the literature of the century. Poetry during the period is chiefly lyric or episodic in character. There are few great constructive works. Browning is an exception, but even his plays are the least successful part of his work. Morris was a great narrative poet, but his narrative was not dramatic, and Tennyson's plays and Idylls of the Kings are the part of his work with which the majority of people would most willingly dispense. Describe the main characteristics of the absurd theatre. The main characteristics of the absurd theatre are: life is essentially meaningless, hence miserable. There is no hope because of the inevitable futility of man's efforts. Reality is unbearable unless relieved by dreams and illusions. Man is fascinated by death, which permanently replaces dreams and illusions. There is no action or plot. Very little happens because nothing meaningful can happen. The final situation is absurd or comic. Absurd drama is not purposeful and specific, as it solves no problem. It is like an abstract painting which is supposed not to convey a definite meaning. Write a short note on T.S. Eliot's vocabulary and language. Eliot's vocabulary is apt and suggestive. He uses language effectively to communicate the predicament of the modern world and modern man. He enriched English language and transformed it into a suitable medium for the expression of the complexities and intricacies of contemporary urban life. He was a great experimenter with verse forms. In his long poetic career, he experimented with over 40 meters. Eliot has exercised a complex and continuing influence on English poetry. His memorable contribution lies in creating contemporary consciousness in poetry. He gave new direction to modern poetry as Dryden had done after the Restoration and Wordsworth at the end of the 18th century. While his poetry has remained imitable, he has shown a new direction in the spheres of versification and imagery. Eliot's successors, Louis MacNeice, Cecil D. Levish, Stephen Stavanger, W.H. Auden, and many others owe him a special gratitude. Write a short note on the transitional poets of modern age. Modern age was an age which marked a definite break with the past, a challenge to authority, and assertion in the right to be anarchist in broad, anarchist in thought and in form, romantic, realistic, passionate, self-conscious age when writers were intensely critical of the composition of society and were beginning to be critical of the individual soul. The first 2 decades of the 20th century may be treated as a transitional period. There was no poet of promise. John Davidson, W.E. Henley, Alfred Austin, William Watson, Francis Thompson, and A.E. Housman are some of the transitional poets. Among the transitional poets, Hardy, Bridges, and Kipling deserve discuss. Thomas Hardy, 1840 to 1928, was the renowned novelist who composed Wessex poems of the past and the present, the dynasts, times, laughing stocks, song and trifles, winter words, and collected poems, and Psyche, Demeter. Collected poems, scored James finds 3 main elements in his poetry. Nature is her sweeter or wider moods, humanity, breathing, and passionate and destiny. presiding over all, cruel in its blindness. Robert Bridges, 1844 to 1930, suddenly blazed into fame in 1913 when he was appointed post laureate. His works include shorter poems Prometheus, The Fire Giver, Arrows and Psyche, Demeter, the political works of Robert Bridges, and his masterpiece, The Treatment of Beauty. Bridges' poetry is conspicuous for classical vigor, sweetness, elegance, spontaneity, faultless versification, and scholarly simplicity. His similes are simple and dear. He keeps his emotions in restraints. Rudyard Kipling, 1865 to 1936, was greatly influenced by imperialism and the superiority of the British to the darkly mysterious natives. His works include Departmental Ditties, Barak, Room Ballad, The Seven Seas, The Five Nations, and the inclusive verse and poems. He was a singer of the glories of the imperialism. He was against slave nations. He called upon Englishmen to take up the white man's burden and reap his own reward. He had his unique faculty of seeing the romance of modern life. He has got more poetry out of machinery than any other poet. Much of Kipling's verse is third rate and does not rise above the level of doggerel. Those poems which express a quiet love of England have the marks of good poetry, restraint, fresh imagery, and varied music. What is Victorian period? How this period was important for the English readers and learners? Because in this period Queen Victoria came at the throne and ascended in 1837. The period of Victorian age in English is almost with the reason of Queen Victoria, right? Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 and her reign continued till 1901 when she breathed her last. However, the critics consider the Victorian period in English literature from 1837 to 1890. Tennyson, Browning, Matthew Arnold, Rossetti, Swinburne are the main poets of this period. The period is marked by strictness but is somewhat conventional in morals, inclining to prudery and solemnity. What are the characteristics of Victorian period? There is an element of romanticism in all the Victorian poets, but the spiritual change and philosophic change were there. Victorian poets were not spiritual and philosophical like Wordsworth and some other romantic poets. Two strongly marked characteristics affected Victorian life and thoughts. One is the growth of democratic spirit, and second one is the epic development of the scientific ideas and the growth of scientific spirit. Democratic spirit in Victorian poetry. In the poetry of the Victorian period, the democratic spirit is conspicuously reflected. We can trace the spirit in Tennyson's Locksley Hall and Browning's Cry of the Children. In the fiction and story writers or tellers, we find it covered with the mantle of the reformer. Social reconstruction is written in big letters right across the voluminous works of Charles Dickens. Some deal with the industrial unrest of the time. Kingsley preaches the gospel of sanitation. The Israeli paints the political democracy of CEW. George talks of social, political, and economic justice. Discoveries leading to new scientific ideas. The geological discoveries of Sir Charles Lyell, the biological investigation of Robert Chambers prepared the way for Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. Thomas Huxley and Herbert Spencer. All these intellectual streams of thoughts flowed over into the literature of the age and influenced it profoundly. Poets in scientific spirit. Tennyson treats nature as an imaginative man of science. Robert Browning is often more like an analytical chemist than an artist. Matthew Arnold is largely occupied by the discrepancies between scientific discoveries and religious faith. Novelist. Among the novelists of the age of voice, scientific spirit, the names of the Thomas Hardy and some other readily occur. Poetic drama. Poetic drama is not merely a drama which is written in verse, because prose may also be its effective medium. It is in fact a blending of the poetic and dramatic elements in a fruitful union. Here poetry is an integral part of the play, twined with plot, character and their interplay, not an element of isolated beauty or lyricism for its own sake, as is the case with splendid lyricism in some parts of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. For example, at the same time, the dramatic elements must be capable of sustaining the poetic grace and intensity. It means its themes and characters should be poetically convinced and should be larger than the average humility and humdrum monotony of the daily life. The passions and emotions permitting them should be naturally productive of the poetic expression, calculated to lift the mind of the spectator above the sphere of our ordinary joys and sorrows, and send the penetrating gaze of the inner vision far down below the surface of life to the very springs of the human action and human activities. Theatre and absurd. Critics believe that theatre of the absurd arose as a movement from the doubts and fears surrounding World War II and what many people saw as the degeneration of traditional moral and political values. The movement flourished in France, Germany and England as well as in Scandinavian countries. Several of the founding works of the movement include Jean Genet's The Maiden 1947, Eugene Loncos, The Bald Soprano 1950, Arthur Adamos' Ping Pong 1955 and Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot 1953. Beckett's death in 1989 is said to mark the close of the movement's popularity. According to Dr. S.C. Mundra, the main characteristics of the absurd theatre are: life is essentially meaningless, hence miserable. There is no hope because of the inevitable futility of man's efforts. Reality is unbearable unless relieved by dreams and illusions. Man is fascinated by that which permanently replaces dreams and illusions. There is no action or plot that happens because nothing meaningful can happen. The final situation is absurd or comic. Absurd drama is not purposeful and specific as it solves no problem. It is like an abstract painting which is supposed not to convey a definite meaning. The theatre of the absurd also seems to have been a reaction to the disappearance of the religious dimensions from the contemporary life. The absurd theatre can be seen as an attempt to restore the importance of myth and ritual to our age by making man aware of the ultimate realities of his condition, by instilling in him again the lost sense of cosmic wonder and primal angus. The absurd theatre hopes to achieve this by shocking man out of an existence that has become trite, mechanical, and complacent. It is felt that there is mystical experience in confronting the limits of human conditions. Write the chief characteristics of modern poetry describing its tendencies. Modern age has inherited the political and social legacy from 19th century. Its predecessors in the form of twin key words democracy and reform. The 20th century is hardly anything more than the mere extension of these two principles. At the beginning of the present century, Britain was undoubtedly the mightiest world power with a far-flung empire, but as a result of the two world wars, and especially after the second, that empire is no more. Her supremacy has now passed to USA and Russia. Britain has reduced to a second-class power. The death of Queen Victoria in January 1901, after a reign of 64 years, marked the end of an epoch. The Victorian epoch. She was succeeded by her son Edward VII. Tendencies of modern poetry. Poetry of revolt. The modern age has proved inimical to Victorian tradition, and modern poetry is essentially the poetry of revolt. But it does not mean that all modern poets have reacted against the older traditions in poetry. Sir William Watson and Sir Henry Newbolt and traditionalists in verse. There are other poets who, while dissatisfied with the spirit of the Victorians, have yet shown the greater respect for traditions in form and diction, quest for novelty. The spirit of revolt in the modern poetry has been manifested in many ways and in many directions. The spirit of revolt is the result of a very natural desire for novelty after years of monotonous poetry which had begun to show signs of exhaustion and lifelessness. The spirit of revolt was nourished by the spirit of ingenuity and the fruit of the modern science. The age of interrogation. Modern age has rightly been called the age of interrogation, for old values in literature, like those in life, have been questioned. In the field of poetry, the revolt has been directed not only against subject matter but also against the older meters and diction. The freedom in the choice of subjects has been accompanied by a freedom in the form of expression. Even as early as 1855, Walt Whitman had published his volume of free verse poems, Leaves of Grass, and in the last decade of the 19th century, Hopkins had evolved a surprisingly new manner of expression. The imagists like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot have written poems philosophical and physiological in nature. Patriotism. The poetry of patriotism, of the love of homeland, of the sea and its defenders, has received splendid addition in the field of modern poetry. The Great War inspired poets like Rupert Brooke to write some intensely patriotic poems, while Kipling, Sussex and Hilaire Belloc's The South Country are two of the best known poems and that have been inspired by a love of English countryside. Sea life has been sufficiently represented in the poetry of Masefield and Kipling. Humanism. One of the outstanding features of the modern poetry is humanism. Modern poets exhibit a passion for humanity and a deep sympathy with all classes of man. John Masefield generally deals sympathetically with the lower classes of England and is their representative poet. Rudyard Kipling describes with great sympathy and insight the life of the common soldier, while W. W. Gibson describes with equal sympathy and insight the life of common laborers and the courage and loyalty of workers. Some modern poets have gone further still and revealed communistic sympathies, and among such poets may be mentioned the names of Cecil Day, Lavish, Auden, and Stephen Spender. सर थोड़ा पानी पिला दो. The range of poetic diction. The range of diction in modern poetry has been extended to include slang words, colloquialism and jargon. Passages in John Masfield's poetry mark the limit to which this movement has been carried. This was a healthy, though a rather ugly, reaction to a kind of poetic diction that the typically Victorian poets had. The extension of subject matter was even more remarkable. Every subject now is considered capable of poetic treatment. The modern poets have discovered elements of poetry in train, cars and railway trains, locomotives and aeroplanes, the factory and the stock exchange. Mansfield wrote his songs about the dirt and the dross and the dust and the scum of the earth. W. Gibson Thank you, sir. W. Gibson in his songs praised the craze of the man at the machine and described the underworld of mining localities. The modern poets have taught us to seek beauty in unexpected places, even in things which we used to think dirty and ugly. Love or nature. In spite of his preoccupation with a variety of subjects, the modern poet has not ceased to love nature. Indeed, a deep love for nature has found expression in modern poetry. Our poets have widened horizons of beauty by describing the loveliness of subjects like wilderness and wet of nature. However, the attitude of modern poet to nature is different from that of many of the older poets, such as Wordsworth or Shelley. There is nothing spiritual, philosophical about this attitude because he never advises us to look up to nature and teachings or to see in her the manifestation of the one spirit. He approaches nature as a lover and finds joy and delight in her. He is sensitive to her beauties and often invests with her with his own moods. The nature poetry of W.H. Davies is simple and clear, full of the wonder of a child looking out on the world for the first time. Edmund Blundell in his poems reveals many of the little noticed things of nature. It is easy to illustrate from these and other poets the love of nature and the variety in the treatment of nature in modern poetry. Mood of pessimism and disillusionment. The modern age is an age of disillusionment. We often come across a mood of pessimism and disillusionment in modern poetry, particularly in the delicately chiseled poems of Houseman and in some of Eliot's poems such as The Waste or The Hollow Man. Escapism Though realism in the avowed aim of many of our modern poets, these are poets who have tried to escape from the bitter realities of life into regions of fantasy and imagination. Alfred Noyes creates a world of his own, peopled by fairies, dwarfs, and magicians, along with other fantastic things. The poetry of the Walter de la Mare, with its uncanny atmosphere, takes us to dreamland and to a wonderland. Mysticism, symbolism. The poet of Celtic revival like W.B. Yeats and George Russell have exhibited a love of mysticism and symbolism. Their poetry is often colored by the characteristics brooding melancholy of the Celt and by a richness of imaginative vision. Mysticism is not one of the main notes of modern poetry, but it appears in the poetry of Francis Thompson and in Ralph Hudson's Song of Honor. Dear friends, scholars and learners, teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, those who are listening from the field of science, religion, spirituality, arts, commerce and engineering, and especially students of literature, those who are studying in the different universities, nationally and internationally, they must go through these fundamentals of short terms and literary terms. By going through these particular fundamentals of the literary terms and literary items, definitely you will improve your knowledge and even score in your examination. Students, those who are going to appear in examination in the next month, they must prepare fundamentally themselves by listening the words. I thank again the most respected, honorable present Prime Minister Dr. Modi ji and our friends, scholars, learners, university scholars, researchers, those who are busy in doing research. They must go through the true research, that is the research of freedom of our soul, that is greatly required for the upliftment and betterment of our nation and society, for doing something nicer, finer, greater, personally, professionally, publicly. It is very necessary that we are to spend maximum time with nature, and we must pray to God for establishing peace in the world, for maintaining the spiritual standard of our nation, for keeping, for sustaining, maintaining our environment clean and pollution free. If there will be no pollution, so automatically temperature will come down and atmospherically, environmentally, we will feel more energetic and we will feel the peace and pleasure of life with the nature. If naturally we will keep our thoughts with the basic elements of nature, with air, fire, soil, sky and water. By keeping ourselves in the company of nature, we must feel friendly and familiarly. We are to communicate with nature. There is no need of any specific language. Through sound and light, we can communicate with nature. That will help us in providing peace of mind. So dear friends, Worldly people may deceive, defeat, beat, cheat, but this is only the nature that can make us have lasting soothing effect of our mind and heart. Thank you, listeners and learners. Nice to meet all of you. Nice to see all of you.